November 1944. A freezing morning in Nebraska. A German woman steps off a military truck. Her hands are shaking. Her back is broken. And her mind is filled with one terrifying thought. She is about to die. For years, she had seen the photographs. Beaten women. Tortured prisoners. Americans, she was told, showed no mercy to their enemies. But then something happened that she never expected. An American soldier walked toward her. Not with a gun, not with handcuffs, but with a smile. And weeks later, that same enemy would give her a gift so simple, so unexpected, that it would bring her to tears and change everything she believed about humanity. A pillow. Yes, a pillow. But this was no ordinary pillow. And this story is no ordinary story. Stay with me until the end, because what happened in that American prison camp will challenge everything you think you know about war, enemies, and the true meaning of mercy. If you love stories that reveal the hidden side of history, hit that subscribe button right now, like this video, and let's uncover this forgotten truth together. The truck stopped at the gates of Camp Sutton just after noon. Thea Voss sat in the back of the canvas-covered vehicle, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her spine pressed against the wooden bench in the only position that did not send fire down her legs. Around her sat 11 other German women, all of them nurses. All of them captured in France 3 weeks earlier when the Allied advance had overrun their field hospital. They had not spoken much during the long journey from the East Coast. There was nothing to say. They all knew what was coming. At least they thought they knew. For 2 years, the German Ministry of Propaganda had circulated photographs among medical units serving near the front lines. The images showed women in torn uniforms, their faces bruised, their eyes hollow. The captions beneath the photographs described what American soldiers did to female prisoners. The stories were specific. They were horrifying, and they had been repeated so many times that every woman in that truck believed them completely. Thea had seen those photographs pinned to the wall of the field hospital tent where she worked. She had read the warnings. She had listened to officers tell the nurses that if they were ever captured, they should expect no mercy. The Americans, they were told, did not follow the rules of war. They did not respect the Geneva Convention. They were barbarians disguised in clean uniforms. And so when the truck lurched to a stop and the canvas flap was pulled back, Thea braced herself for violence. Instead, a woman stepped forward into the light. She wore an American uniform, olive drab and neatly pressed. Her hair was pinned back under her cap. Her face was not twisted with cruelty or hatred. She was smiling. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, a smile of simple, ordinary welcome. Her name was Sergeant Lucille Carver, though Thea would not learn that until later. In that moment, all Thea could process was the impossible contradiction standing before her. An American soldier. A woman. Smiling. "Welcome to Camp Sutton," Sergeant Carver said in slow, clear English. "Please step down carefully. You will be processed and assigned quarters." One by one, the women climbed down from the truck. Thea moved slowly, her body stiff from hours of sitting, her back screaming with each small shift of weight. She expected hands to grab her. She expected shouting. She expected guns. There were guards, yes, but they stood at a distance, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their expressions bored. They looked like men doing a job they found dull. The camp itself stretched across the flat Nebraska landscape in neat, organized rows. Wooden barracks painted a dull gray-green. Gravel roads. Barbed wire fences that marked the perimeter but did not seem designed to punish. Everything was clean. Everything was orderly. It looked nothing like the chaos and mud of the field hospitals Thea had worked in for the past year. The women were led to a processing station, a low building where they were checked for disease and lice, asked their names and medical histories, and given identification numbers. Thea stood in line, watching the other women ahead of her. None of them were being mistreated. The American medics were efficient, but not rough. They spoke little, but when they did, their tone was neutral, almost polite. When Thea's turn came, she stood before a doctor who introduced himself as Captain Theodore Ashworth. He was a man in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm, steady manner that came from years of practice. He asked her questions in German that was slow but clear enough to understand. "Do you have any injuries?" he asked. Thea hesitated. The pain in her back had been with her for so long that it had become part of her, but she had learned to hide it. In the German military, an injured nurse was a useless nurse. She had seen women reassigned, sent away, forgotten, and so she had kept working, kept silent, kept moving in ways that minimized the stabbing sensation that radiated from her lower spine. "No," she said. Captain Ashworth looked at her for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Then he nodded and made a note on her file. The barracks where the women were assigned was a long building with rows of narrow cots. Each cot had a thin mattress, a single wool blanket, and a small pillow stuffed with something that felt like straw. Thea was assigned a cot near the center of the room. She lowered herself onto it carefully, and the relief of lying flat was so immediate and so profound that she closed her eyes and let out a breath she had been holding for hours. Ketta Lindner, a nurse from Berlin who had been assigned the cot beside hers, leaned over and whispered, "This is not what they told us it would be." Thea opened her eyes and stared at the wooden beams of the ceiling. "No," she said quietly, "it is not." That first night, the camp was silent except for the sound of boots on gravel as guards walked their routes. Thea lay on her cot and tried to understand what was happening. She had been captured. She was a prisoner of war. She was in the hands of the enemy. But she had not been beaten. She had not been starved. She had been given a bed, a blanket, and a pillow. She had been spoken to with something that resembled respect. It made no sense. And yet, as exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, one thought remained clear in her mind. Everything she had been told was a lie. But if that was true, what else had been a lie? The injury had happened 4 months earlier, in a place Thea no longer wanted to remember. She had been working in a field hospital outside Caen, in northern France. The hospital was not really a hospital at all. It was a collection of tents and wooden frameworks erected in a muddy field half a mile behind the German front lines. The tents leaked when it rained. The wooden supports creaked in the wind, and the wounded came in faster than the staff could process them. Thea had worked 18-hour shifts in that place, moving from one blood-soaked stretcher to the next, her hands steady even when her mind screamed for rest. She had loved being a nurse before the war. She had worked in a clean hospital in Hamburg where the floors smelled of disinfectant and hope. But the war had turned healing into something else. Now she patched up soldiers only so they could be sent back to die. On the day of the injury, she had been standing beside a makeshift operating table, handing instruments to a surgeon who was trying to save a 19-year-old boy with shrapnel in his chest. The air smelled of blood and sweat and the sharp chemical tang of ether. Outside, the artillery had been firing steadily for hours, the distant thunder of shells exploding on both sides of the line. Then, one of those shells landed close. Not close enough to kill, but close enough to shake the earth. The wooden framework supporting the tent collapsed inward with a sharp crack. Thea had no time to move. A heavy beam struck her across the lower back and drove her to her knees. The pain was instant and blinding. A white-hot knife that cut from her spine down both legs. She had gasped, unable to breathe for a moment, but around her said yes. The chaos continued. The surgeon was still working. The boy on the table was still dying. And outside, more wounded were arriving. Thea forced herself to stand. She handed the surgeon the clamp he needed, and she did not mention the pain. For 4 months, she had carried that injury in silence. She learned to move differently, to bend from the hips instead of the waist, to sleep on hard ground without rolling over. She wrapped her back tightly with strips of cloth to keep her spine as straight as possible, and she told no one. In the German military, injured personnel were reassigned or dismissed. She could not afford to be seen as weak. By the time she was captured, the pain had become a constant companion. It woke her in the morning. It followed her through the day. It whispered to her at night that something inside her was broken and would never fully heal. Now, at Camp Sutton, the pain was about to become impossible to hide. On her second morning in the camp, a bell rang at 6 o'clock. The sound echoed through the barracks, sharp and metallic. Thea pushed herself up carefully, moving her legs over the side of the cot one at a time. Every movement had to be calculated. Every shift of weight had to be controlled. Breakfast was served in a long dining hall with wooden tables and benches. The meal was simple, but more generous than Thea had seen in months. Oatmeal, bread with butter, black coffee, a small bowl of canned peaches. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to rations equivalent to the detaining power's own garrison troops. The Americans were following the rules precisely, but Thea could barely eat. The bench offered no back support, and sitting upright for more than a few minutes sent sharp pains radiating down her legs. After breakfast, the women were assigned to work details. Thea and 6 others were sent to the camp laundry. The laundry was a low building filled with large metal tubs and clotheslines strung from wall to wall. The air inside was hot and damp, thick with the smell of soap and wet fabric. The work was hard and repetitive. The women washed uniforms, sheets, and towels by hand or scrubbing them in basins of scalding water, wringing them out, and hanging them to dry. Every task required bending. Every movement required twisting, and every minute made Thea's back worse. The supervisor was a broad-shouldered woman named Corporal Mabel Strickland. She had the no-nonsense manner of someone who had done physical labor her entire life. She was not cruel, but she was not sympathetic either. She simply expected the work to be done efficiently and correctly. Thea worked in silence, gritting her teeth against the pain. She bent over the washing tubs, her hands red and raw from the hot water, her spine screaming with every twist. She wrung out heavy sheets, the weight of the wet fabric pulling at her back in ways that made her vision blur. She reached up to hang laundry on the lines, and each time she lifted her arms, the stabbing sensation grew worse. Keta, working beside her, noticed. "You are hurt," Keta said quietly in German. "I am fine," Thea whispered. "You move like an old woman." "I said I am fine." Keta said nothing more, but her eyes held doubt. By the 3rd day, Thea could no longer straighten fully. She stood at a slight angle, her body compensating for the pain. Her legs ached, her hips throbbed, and the stabbing in her lower back had become constant. On the afternoon of her 5th day, Corporal Strickland stopped beside her. Thea was bent over a tub, wringing out a heavy blanket. Her back was twisted at an angle she knew was wrong. Corporal Strickland watched her for a long moment. Then she said in simple English, "You are hurt. You need the medic." Thea shook her head. "No, I am fine." But Corporal Strickland had already turned and was calling to one of the guards. Within minutes, Thea was being escorted across the camp toward a small building with a red cross painted on the door. The infirmary smelled like every hospital Thea had ever worked in. Antiseptic, soap, the faint metallic tang of surgical instruments. For a moment, standing in the doorway, she was back in Hamburg before the war, back in the clean white corridors where healing was still possible. But this was not Hamburg. This was a prison camp, and she was not a nurse here. She was a prisoner. The guard who had escorted her gestured for her to sit on a wooden bench near the entrance. Then he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Thea sat carefully, her back screaming in protest. The bench was hard and flat, offering no support. She leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the seat, and tried to find a position that hurt less. A man appeared from a back room. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with weathered skin and the kind of calm, competent expression that came from years of dealing with injured people. He wore a medic's uniform with sergeant stripes on his sleeve. "My name is Sergeant Vernon Oakes," he said in slow, clear English. Then he repeated it in rough but understandable German. "Ich bin Sergeant Oakes." Thea nodded, but said nothing. Sergeant Oakes pulled up a stool and sat down in front of her. He did not tower over her. He did not demand answers. He simply looked at her, with the kind of professional assessment that Thea herself had used 1,000 times when evaluating patients. "Corporal Strickland says you are in pain," he said in his careful German. "Where does it hurt?" Thea hesitated. Every instinct told her to lie, to hide the weakness, to protect herself. But the pain was so constant now, so unbearable, that she found herself unable to maintain the fiction any longer. "My back," she said quietly. "My lower back." "How long?" 4 months. Sergeant Oakes raised his eyebrows slightly. 4 months? And you have not been treated? There was no time. There was too much work. He nodded slowly, as though this made perfect sense to him. "Can you stand up and remove your shirt? I need to examine you." Thea's face flushed with embarrassment, but she obeyed. She stood slowly, her movements stiff and careful, and unbuttoned her uniform shirt. Underneath, she wore a thin undershirt. Sergeant Oakes gestured for her to lie face down on an examination table against the wall. The table was covered with a clean white sheet. Thea lowered herself onto it, and the relief of lying flat was immediate. For the first time in hours, the stabbing pain eased slightly. Sergeant Oakes' hands were gentle but thorough. He pressed along her spine, asking her in his rough German where the pain was worst. When he reached the spot where the beam had struck her, Thea flinched involuntarily. "Here?" he asked. "Yes." He continued the examination, testing her reflexes, asking her to move her legs, checking her range of motion. It was clear he knew what he was doing. When he finished, he helped her sit up and told her to wait. "I want the doctor to see you," he said. Thea's stomach tightened with fear. "Why? What is wrong?" "You have a significant injury," Sergeant Oakes said simply. "The doctor needs to examine you and decide on treatment." "Treatment?" The word felt strange in her mouth. "But I am a prisoner." Sergeant Oakes looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Yes," he said, "and under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war are entitled to the same medical care as our own soldiers. The doctor will see you now." He disappeared into the back room and returned a moment later with Captain Theodore Ashworth, the same doctor who had examined her during processing. Captain Ashworth carried a file folder and wore the same calm, steady expression Thea remembered. "Miss Voss?" he said in fluent German. "Sergeant Oakes tells me you have been hiding an injury for 4 months. That was foolish." Thea said nothing. Captain Ashworth conducted his own examination, more detailed than Sergeant Oakes's. He asked questions about the original injury, about how the pain had changed over time, about what made it better or worse. His hands moved along her spine with the precision of a surgeon who had spent years studying anatomy. When he finished, he sat down on the stool and looked at her directly. "You have severe muscle and ligament damage in your lower back," he said. "There is also likely compression of one of the nerve roots in your spine. This is why you have pain radiating down your legs. The injury is old, and it has been made worse by months of untreated strain and the physical labor you have been doing since you arrived here." Thea listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You need rest," Captain Ashworth continued. "You need proper support for your spine when you sit or stand. And you need medication to reduce the inflammation and manage the pain. I am going to prescribe pain medication, and Sergeant Oakes will teach you exercises to strengthen the muscles around your spine." "Why?" The question came out before Thea could stop it. Captain Ashworth tilted his head slightly. "Why what? Why are you treating me? I am your enemy." The doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are a prisoner of war. Under international law, you are entitled to medical care. But more than that, you are a nurse. You spent years caring for the sick and injured. You deserve the same care you gave to others." He stood and made notes in her file. "You will not return to the laundry. I am reassigning you to light duty, and I am authorizing the construction of a special support cushion for your back. It will take a few days to make, but it will help." Thea stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. A special cushion, made specifically for her. A prisoner. "I do not understand," she whispered. Captain Ashworth looked at her with something that might have been kindness. "You do not need to understand," he said. "You only need to accept the help." As she left the infirmary that afternoon, escorted back to the barracks by the same guard, Thea felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had been told her entire life that the Americans were brutal, that they violated every rule, that prisoners could expect nothing but cruelty. But she had just been examined, diagnosed, and promised treatment by the very people she had been taught to fear. And for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to believe that she might survive this war not just alive, but whole. 3 days passed before Sergeant Oakes called for Thea again. During those 3 days, she had been reassigned from the laundry to lighter work in the camp kitchen. She peeled potatoes, she washed dishes, she sorted supplies. The work was still physical, but it did not require the constant bending and twisting that had made the laundry unbearable. Captain Ashworth had also given her medication, small white pills that she took twice a day with meals. The pills did not eliminate the pain, but they reduced it from unbearable to manageable. Still, sitting remained difficult. The kitchen had wooden stools and benches, none of which provided support for her injured spine. By the end of each shift, Thea's back ached with the same fierce intensity she had felt in the laundry. On the morning of the 4th day, a guard appeared at the kitchen door and told her to report to the infirmary. Thea walked across the camp slowly, her mind turning over possibilities. Perhaps Captain Ashworth had changed his mind about her treatment. Perhaps the medication was needed for American soldiers instead. Perhaps she was being sent back to the laundry after Himoirol. But when she entered the infirmary, Sergeant Oakes was smiling. "Come with me," he said in his rough German. "I have something for you." He led her to a small storage room off the main infirmary space. Inside sat a simple wooden chair, the kind that might be found in any camp building. But attached to the chair was something Thea had never seen before. A cushion. Not a flat pillow like the ones on the barracks cots, but a carefully shaped cushion designed to support the curve of the lower back. It was firm but yielding, covered in canvas fabric, and it had been fitted precisely to the chair so that it would not slip or shift. "One of the German prisoners made it," Sergeant Oakes said. "His name is Gottfried Wenzel. He was a carpenter before the war. Captain Ashworth gave him the measurements and specifications based on your injury, and Wenzel built this." Thea stared at the chair. She could not speak. "Sit," Sergeant Oakes said gently. "Try it." Thea approached the chair slowly, as though it might disappear if she moved too quickly. She lowered herself onto the seat, and as her back settled into the cushion, something happened that she had not expected. The pain changed. It did not vanish. The injury was too old, too deep for that. But the constant stabbing sensation that had lived in her spine for 4 months suddenly eased. The cushion cradled her lower back, holding her spine in proper alignment, distributing her weight in a way that did not compress the damaged nerves. For the first time since the beam had struck her in that field hospital in France, Thea could sit upright without agony. She sat very still, her hands gripping the edge of the seat, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, that tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. Sergeant Oakes pretended not to notice. He busied himself with papers on a nearby shelf, giving her a moment to compose herself. But Thea could not compose herself. The tears came faster, spilling down her cheeks, and she pressed her hands to her face, ashamed and grateful and utterly confused. A cushion. A simple cushion made of wood and canvas and stuffing. It should not have mattered this much. It was just a piece of furniture. But it was not just a piece of furniture. It was proof that she had been seen. Proof that her pain had been noticed. Proof that someone had cared enough to measure and design and build something specifically for her comfort. She was a prisoner of war. She was German. She was the enemy. And yet, an American doctor had authorized the use of camp resources to ease her suffering. A German prisoner had spent hours carefully crafting this cushion to exact specifications, and an American medic was standing quietly in the corner, giving her space to cry. According to the records kept by the U.S. War Department, over 495,000 Axis prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States during World War II. Medical treatment logs showed that American camp doctors treated everything from dental cavities to major surgeries, following the same standards they used for their own troops. This was not exceptional kindness. This was policy. But policy felt like mercy when you had been told to expect cruelty. After a long moment, Sergeant Oakes turned back to her. "You feel better now?" he asked. Thea nodded, unable to speak. "Good," he said. "The chair is yours. You will take it with you to the barracks. Use it whenever you need to sit. Captain Ashworth's orders." He paused, then added something that Thea would remember for the rest of her life. "You work with us now," he said. "We take care of our people. Our people. Not the prisoners, not the enemy. Our people." The word settled over Thea like a weight and a gift at the same time. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. "Thank you?" she said in halting English. "Thank you." Sergeant Oakes nodded. "You will continue your exercises every morning. You will take your medication, and you will use this chair. Your back will not heal completely, but it will get better. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good. Now go. Take the chair with you." Thea stood slowly, reluctant to leave the support of the cushion even for a moment. She picked up the chair, surprised by how light it was, and carried it out of the infirmary. As she walked back across the camp toward the barracks, other prisoners stared. A German woman carrying a chair, tears still drying on her face, moving as though she held something sacred. Keta met her at the barracks door. "What is that, she asked. "A chair," Thea said quietly. "They made it for me for my back." Keta stared at the cushion, then at Thea's face, then back at the chair. "They made this? For you?" "Yes." Keta was silent for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Everything they told us was a lie." Thea set the chair down beside her cot and sat in it once more, feeling the blessed relief as the cushion supported her spine. "Yes," she whispered. Everything was a lie. 2 weeks after receiving the chair, Thea was called to Captain Ashworth's office. She walked across the camp with careful steps, the December wind cutting through her thin jacket. The Nebraska winter had arrived in full force, and the flat landscape offered no protection from the cold. Snow covered the ground in patches, and the sky hung low and gray above the barracks. Captain Ashworth's office was a small room at the back of the infirmary building. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, an American flag on the wall. Nothing more. When Thea entered, Captain Ashworth gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself into the chair carefully, missing the support of her special cushion immediately. "Your back is improving," he said in German. It was not a question. "Yes," Thea agreed. "The medication helps. The exercises help. The cushion helps most of all." Captain Ashworth nodded. "Good. I have been reviewing your file. Before the war, you worked as a nurse in Hamburg. You have training in patient care, wound treatment, and medical documentation. Is this correct?" "Yes." "And during the war, you served in field hospitals near the front lines. You treated combat injuries. You assisted in surgeries. You worked under difficult conditions." "Yes." Captain Ashworth leaned back in his chair and studied her for a moment. "I have a proposal for you, Miss Voss. This camp holds over 2,000 prisoners, mostly German soldiers. Many of them become sick or injured. We have limited medical staff, and we have a language barrier. I need someone who can translate, who can explain symptoms and treatments, who can help the prisoners understand what is happening to them." Thea listened, not quite understanding where this was going. "I want you to become the German medical liaison for this camp," Captain Ashworth continued. You would work in the infirmary alongside Sergeant Oakes and the nursing staff. You would help examine patients, document their conditions, and communicate with them in German. You would advocate for their needs and ensure they receive proper care." He paused. "In exchange, you would receive better quarters, slightly improved rations, and a small amount of camp currency you can use at the canteen. You would also have access to your chair at all times during your shifts." Thea sat very still. A position of responsibility, meaningful work, the chance to use her training again. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you are qualified, because you understand both German and English well enough to translate, and because I have watched how you carry yourself. You are professional. You are calm. You do not complain. These are qualities I value." Thea thought about the offer. She thought about the laundry, the endless bending and lifting. She thought about the kitchen, the mindless peeling and scrubbing. And she thought about the infirmary, the familiar smell of antiseptic, the sense of purpose that came from helping others heal. "I accept," she said. Captain Ashworth nodded as though he had expected nothing else. "You will start tomorrow. Report to Sergeant Oakes at 7 o'clock. The work in the infirmary became the center of Thea's life. She arrived each morning before dawn, when the camp was still quiet, and the only sounds were the footsteps of guards on their rounds. She set up her chair in the corner of the main examination room and prepared the supplies for the day. Bandages, antiseptic, medical forms, thermometers. When the patients came, she translated. She listened to German soldiers describe their symptoms in their own language, then explained them to Sergeant Oakes or Lorraine Hensley, the American nurse who worked the morning shift. She helped hold patients still during painful procedures. She documented every treatment in careful handwriting, maintaining the same records she had kept in Hamburg before the war. The work was familiar, but the context was not. In the German military, resources had always been scarce. Bandages were reused. Medications were rationed. Prisoners received nothing unless they were useful. But here, in this American camp in the middle of Nebraska, the rules were different. Every prisoner who needed medical care received it. American doctors treated German soldiers with the same procedures they used on their own troops. According to the records Thea helped maintain, the camp infirmary saw an average of 40 patients per day, ranging from minor cuts to serious infections. Every case was documented. Every treatment was recorded. Every prisoner was treated as a patient first and an enemy second. This was not propaganda. This was daily life. Lorraine Hensley became something like a friend. She was a young woman from Kansas with brown hair and kind eyes. She spoke no German, but she and Thea found ways to communicate through gestures and shared work. During quiet moments, Lorraine would tell Thea about her family, about her parents who ran a small farm, about her younger brother who was fighting somewhere in the Pacific. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a long shift, Lorraine handed Thea a small gift, a bar of chocolate. "For you," she said in English. "You work hard." Thea accepted the chocolate with trembling hands. It was such a small thing, a bar of candy, but it represented something much larger. Then the letter arrived. It came in a thin envelope that had been censored and resealed multiple times. The handwriting on the outside was her mother's, shaky and thin. Thea opened it with unsteady fingers and read. Hamburg had been bombed. Entire neighborhoods were gone. The apartment building where Thea had grown up no longer existed. Her mother was living in a shelter on the outskirts of the city. Food was scarce. Medicine was impossible to find. Thousands of people had died in the firestorms. Her father, Konrad Voss, had not been heard from in months. He was presumed dead on the Eastern Front. Her sister Crystal was working in a factory. Her brother Albrecht was missing. The letter ended with words that broke Thea's heart. "I am glad you are safe, even as a prisoner. At least I know you are being fed. Please come home when you can. We need you." Thea sat in her chair for a long time after reading the letter. The cushions supported her back. The walls of the infirmary surrounded her. Outside, the Nebraska wind howled across the empty plains. She was safe. She was fed. She was receiving medical care. And her family was starving in the ruins of a destroyed city. The guilt was overwhelming. She had been given mercy while her people suffered. She had been treated with kindness while her mother had nothing. For 3 days, Thea could not work. She could not eat. She could not think clearly. It was Lorraine who finally pulled her back. Lorraine found Thea sitting alone in the corner of the barracks, the letter from her mother clutched in her hands. It was late evening. The other women had gone to the dining hall for supper, but Thea had not moved from her chair in hours. Her eyes were red. Her face was pale. She stared at the thin paper as though reading it again might somehow change the words written there. Lorraine sat down on the cot beside her. She did not speak. She did not try to take the letter away. She simply sat there, her presence quiet and steady. After a long time, Thea began to talk. She spoke in broken English, mixing in German words when she could not find the right translation. She told Lorraine about Hamburg, about the bombs that had destroyed her childhood home. She told her about her father, presumed dead somewhere on the frozen plains of Russia. She told her about her mother, starving in a shelter with no medicine and no hope. She told her about the guilt that was eating her alive. "I am safe here," Thea said, her voice cracking. "I am fed. I am treated well, and my family is dying." Lorraine listened without interrupting. When Thea finished, Lorraine reached out and took her hand. "The war is not your fault," Lorraine said slowly, making sure Thea understood each word. "You did not drop the bombs. You did not start the fighting. You are a nurse. You spent years helping people. That is who you are." Thea shook her head. "But I am here, safe, while they suffer." "Yes," Lorraine said, "and that is terrible. But you cannot help them by destroying yourself. You can only help them by surviving, by being strong, by going home when this is over and rebuilding." She squeezed Thea's hand. "The choices you make now matter. You have chosen to help people here. You have chosen to believe in fairness. That matters, Thea. It matters more than you know." Thea looked at this American woman, this stranger who had become something like a friend. In Lorraine's eyes, she saw no pity. She saw no judgment. She saw only understanding. "How do you know?" Thea whispered. "How do you know it matters?" "Because I have to believe it does," Lorraine said. "My brother is fighting in the Pacific. Every day, I wonder if he is alive or dead. Every day, I pray that if he is captured, someone will treat him the way we are treating you. That is why we do this. That is why we follow the rules. Because we have to believe that kindness is possible, even in war." The words settled over Thea like a blanket. She did not feel healed. The guilt did not disappear. But she felt something shift inside her, a small loosening of the knot that had been strangling her heart. She returned to work the next day. The winter turned to spring. The spring turned to summer. And in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. News of Germany's surrender reached Camp Sutton on a warm, comfortable. But Thea spent the long voyage thinking about everything she had experienced. When she finally arrived in Hamburg, she barely recognized it. The city was rubble. Entire blocks had been erased from existence. The streets were filled with refugees, orphans, chickens, and the walking wounded of a destroyed nation. She found her mother living in a basement shelter on the edge of the city. Wilhelmina Voss was thin and gray, aged far beyond her years. When she saw Thea, she wept. "You survived," her mother said. "You came home." "Yes," Thea said. "I came home." Boink. She set up the chair in their small shelter. Every day, she sat in Atta, the cushion supporting her damaged spine, and every day, she remembered what it represented. 50 years later, when she was an old woman living in a small house in West Germany, Thea would tell her grandchildren about the American prison camp. She would tell them about Captain Ashworth and Sergeant Oakes and Lorraine Hensley. She would tell them about the chair and the cushion and the simple acts of kindness that had changed her understanding of the world. "They did not have to treat us well," she would say. "They had every reason to treat us poorly, but they chose kindness. They chose fairness. They chose to see us as human beings. And that choice mattered. It mattered more than any bomb or bullet or battle." Her grandchildren would listen, sometimes skeptical, sometimes curious. But they were the afternoon. The American staff celebrated quietly. Aware that their prisoners were processing the same news as defeat, Thea stood in the infirmary and listened to the radio announcement, her hand still holding a roll of bandages she had been organizing. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything she had known, everything she had believed, everything she had fought for was gone. But she was alive. And because of that, she had a future. The process of sending prisoners home began slowly. The Americans could not simply release thousands of German soldiers onto the ruins of Europe. There were logistics to consider, paperwork to complete, transportation to arrange. Thea was told that she would be repatriated in late June. Before she left, she made one final request. She went to Captain Ashworth's office and asked if she could take the chair with her. "The cushion," she explained. "It has helped my back so much. The injury is permanent. I will need support for the rest of my life. I would like to bring it home." Captain Ashworth approved the request without hesitation. "Take it," he said, "and remember what you learned here. The world will try to convince you that power comes from cruelty. But you've seen another way. You have experienced fairness and respect, even as a prisoner. Remember that. And when you have the chance, practice it yourself." On the day of her departure, Thea packed her few belongings into a small bag. The chair was disassembled and wrapped carefully in canvas. Gottfried Wenzel, the carpenter who had built it, helped her secure it for the journey. "It will last many years," he told her. "I built it strong." She thanked him. She thanked Sergeant Oakes and Lorraine Hensley and Captain Ashworth. She thanked the guards, who had never been cruel, and the cooks who had fed her, and the countless Americans who had treated her like a human being instead of an enemy. The Schihaboitsum that carried her back to Europe was crowded and uncomfortable. But Thea spent the long voyage thinking about everything she had experienced. When she finally arrived in Hamburg, she barely recognized it. The city was rubble. Entire blocks had been erased from existence. The streets were filled with refugees, orphans, chickens, and the walking wounded of a destroyed nation. She found her mother living in a basement shelter on the edge of the city. Wilhelmina Voss was thin and gray, aged far beyond her years. When she saw Thea, she wept. "You survived," her mother said. "You came home." "Yes," Thea said. "I came home." Boink. She said, "matter more than power." Thea Voss arrived at Camp Sutton expecting cruelty and found mercy instead. She came as an enemy and was treated as a patient. She carried a hidden wound and received healing she never believed possible. A simple cushion, built from wood and canvas by the hands of a fellow prisoner, became the symbol of everything she learned about humanity during the darkest years of the 20th century. The Americans who ran that camp followed rules. They documented every treatment. They fed their prisoners the same rations they gave their own soldiers. They built chairs for women with broken backs. And in doing so, they proved that power does not require brutality, that victory does not demand vengeance, and that the true measure of a nation is how it treats those who are completely at its mercy. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its factories or its armies. It was its principles. And those principles changed one German nurse forever.